coming. It's great to see so many students here. Thanks for coming, guys. And thank you so much to the previous session participants. You might have started something. I just had a conversation with a colleague about doing a collaborative class in sex toys and speculum design from a sculptural, industrial design and digital plus media perspective. So who on earth knows who we can get to sponsor that class? We are here to talk about the aesthetics of performance. And I just want to start by throwing out something that Richard Schechner, one of the founders of the first performance studies departments, which was at NYU's Tisch School of the Arts, still going, and founded in 1980. And what he said about performance studies is, indirection is characteristic of performance studies. This area, field, discipline, often plays at what it is not, tricking those who want to fix it, alarming some, amusing others, and astounding a few, as it winds its way across the deserts of academia. So, with that, I am delighted to introduce our three speakers, who may or may not indirect us, alarm us, astound us, and amuse us, but I'm sure that we will be very interested in everything they have to say. So, Derek Adams, who is a multidisciplinary New York-based artist and curator. Eleanor, I just asked you how to say your name, and now I've completely forgotten. F-A-W. F-A-W?
No, E-W, remember?
Fuchs, thank you. Eleanor Fuchs, who is Professor Emerita of Dramaturgy and Dramatic Criticism at the Yale School of Drama, and Amelia Jones, who is the Robert A. Day Professor in Art and Design and the Vice Dean of Critical Studies, at the Roski School of Art and Design at the University of Southern California. So, Derek, we're going to start with you.
First, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to participate in the symposium. I'm really excited and nervous because as an artist, I don't necessarily consider myself a performance artist, but I do love to entertain ideas of performance and concepts surrounding performance within my practice. And for that, I'm excited to talk about the aesthetics of performance and how it relates to my interests as an artist. I want to start with this piece.
Hi, I am Commander reporting live from the channel. Breaking news this evening. We have just been informed by radical forces that we are all operating on a consciousness level green, which is low. So please stay alert in your travels and report any suspicious program. And remember, if you think something, say something.
Low. L-O-W. Low. I am low on the ground.
This just in. We are receiving reports that many are slowly transitioning from the previously low consciousness level color code green to the more proactive consciousness color code level blue, which is guarding. A positive trend in the right direction, but there is much more work to be done. So as you're becoming more aware of your surroundings, I remind you, if you feel something, say something. I am Jermaine Renee reporting live from the channel. We now resume our regularly scheduled program.
Guarded. G-U-A-R-D-E-D. Guarded. I keep my diary guarded so no one knows my secrets.
Good news tonight. Consciousness levels continue to rise from the previous level blue to our current level yellow, or elevated. This continuing trend toward elevated consciousness is a positive sign for the planet and all of its inhabitants, who are affected by our actions. I'm Jermaine Ranner reporting live from the channel. And remember, if you take something, give something.
Elevator. E-L-E-V-A-T-E-D. Elevator. Today, my mood is elevated.
We interrupt this program with a special bulletin. The consciousness level has been raised yet again. In light of general positivity, the channel has determined that we are at a high consciousness level, orange. Tell a friend. And I remind you, if you want something, make something. I'm Renee Cox reporting live from the channel. Good night, and have an important tomorrow.
High. H-I-G-H. High. The clouds are high in the sky.
Good evening. I come to you tonight with what will be the most important announcement of my news career. I am prepared to confirm that the channel has just raised the consciousness level to color code red, severe. Though severe is not normally associated with a positive finding, we've experienced low, guarded, elevated, and high with limited results. At this time, the channel feels that severe is our only hope. It is not without danger that we enter this stage of consciousness, as counter forces are completely comfortable with severity. And as such, the channel believes the highest level of consciousness is warranted. Again, I remind you, if you have something, share something. I'm Renee Cox reporting live from the channel. May thought help us all.
Severe. S-E-V-E-R-E. Severe. My math test is severe.
So, thank you. That was an excerpt from a performance at BAM, Fishman Building in 2012, part of Next Wave. The piece is called The Channel, Cultural Levitation. So bear with me. I'm trying to get the slideshow going. Okay, cool, I got it. Right? First, I just want to start to talk about categories pertaining to the aesthetic of performance. Until maybe about 2 years ago, I became very interested in dissecting the aesthetics of performance and the principles relating to my artistic practice, but not really as an artist, but more as a cultural producer. I didn't want to entertain the notion that my experience and relationship with academia would solely be responsible for my decision-making, because Columbia University, I related aesthetics with beauty, ugliness, form, and function of more of an institutional critique, which was problematic mainly because most things I find aesthetically pleasing and valuable are usually things that have not been quite or yet discovered or uncovered, which to me makes them that much more interesting and precious. As a black man who is educated in an institutional structure, and also with the history of being a black man in America, you understand that one of the main positions of even being brought here historically was to entertain, was to perform, and perform in various ways, not just dancing and singing, but working and dying and crying. Everything that was created at that time was done in a public space. So being vulnerable as a person of color kind of goes hand in hand with performance and living in this society. what is really interesting about the aesthetics of performance, for me personally, is understanding the value of physical presence and what that really means for me as an artist, and being able to negotiate what that exchange really means with myself and the audience, and what am I interested in revealing through this exchange. So I decided as an artist after graduate school to start already thinking about how to incorporate my ideas in various ways when I'm doing performance. This recent project that opened not too long ago at the Bemis in Omaha is called Crossroad. When I was invited to do the project as an installation, I always think about the audience and the community surrounding the space. And when I was invited to participate in this exhibition or to present an idea in the exhibition, I wanted to really think about the history of Omaha and the separation between the north side and the other sides of Omaha. So I created a piece called Crossroad, which is a combination of a board game, a trivia board game, and a music component that triggers the game. What I was interested in performance in this particular case is how I thought everyone performs. I think we're always in a state of performance in some ways. We present ourselves in many ways, and we participate sometimes willingly and unwillingly, subconsciously, or without knowledge. This particular game, Crossroads, I really invited the gallery goers to participate in the performance. There are also elements of performance that I'm interested in where participants can also witness. They don't have to participate, but witnessing is part of participating. And I always consider that when I'm organizing an exhibition of my work, the idea that anyone in the space is part of the performance, even the audience. And the audience can be put to work in some ways. If not put to work, they can be included in the documentation as an archive of the happening in the installation. And for this particular installation, everything was designed to look like a gigantic board game. There was also an element of surveillance, part of the installation, where people could also witness themselves in the space. So it was all these different levels of awareness and function and entertainment and intellect happening with the trivia. The trivia game is based on American knowledge. And usually with my performances, I try to insert or camouflage what I want the viewer to know versus what the viewer is willing to accept. And gaming is one of those things where you can really camouflage things that, almost like a child, you can educate someone in a way that make them feel like they came across the knowledge on their own, not forced upon them. And I like that. I like the idea that most things that you obtain are based on things you want to absorb versus what you want to reject. There was also instructions on how to play the game on the wall. And that's one element of the aesthetics of performance that really acknowledges the audience and really challenges the audience in a way that is very familiar but unfamiliar. Most people know about games and they know about trivia. They also are aware of certain aspects of music. And that was a kind of an interesting way to entice people to be a part of this piece. This is another performance that I did for Performa 15. It was a radio station structure similar to the other piece I just showed. It also had a radio station component where I can project what's happening in the space into the world. So it becomes another part of performance where you can narrate the way that things are happening for a person who's not there to imagine the performative action that's happening in the space. So it's like an audio performance. This particular performance was a reenactment of a circus. I was invited to participate in Performa 15, and the concept was surrounding the Renaissance. So in this particular performance, what I like to do a lot of times in my performance work is really consider the space. The space is very significant in the planning of all of my performative works. Who the audience is, what do they know, what do they don't know, the access to the space visually, how open the space is to the community. Because that's one very important thing to think about when I think about how to present an idea, how to package a performance, and how to present it and be effective in the presentation of your idea through performance. Is all those things, even the way the door opens in the space, or where the door is located, if it's a ground space, is a street space, all those things are very important to be as effective as you can be if you're trying to communicate an idea with performance. And as a visual artist, I'm really aware of those things, not just what I'm doing, but what everyone else in the space is doing. And when I'm asked to perform in a space, I consider the history of the space, the function and the mission of the space. And I work with that as part of my performance. In the space, previous image of Bemis, I was thinking about the openness of the community and learning the community. And this gaming allowed me to meet people and be stationed in the gallery at a certain point, and people came to the gallery and I met them. And being a stranger to Omaha, that was a part of my performance and my engagement with them through this performative action. This particular piece, I invited a series of other performers to participate with me in this circus structure. And what I tried to do with this particular performance is create parallels of black entertainment within the circus structure. I tried to make a comparison between the idea of the phrase twerking with the contortionist body, and how the contortionist body, which is part of a way of operating the body and being suggestive, that's not necessarily a thing of spectacle, but a thing of transformation. I invited other performers who sang, comedians, things that related directly to the structure of the circus, but not necessarily leaning strong on the rigidness of that concept of the circus, really breaking out of that structure. A lot of performances that I create use the aesthetics that are already in place based on certain aspects of culture and entertainment within the culture. With that familiarity, I'm able to really break down certain archetypes and stereotypes that are created within these pre-existing structures, and to make the viewer more aware of the construct of identity, race, sex, entertainment, who's the players, what are their roles, all these things that I think are very significant in understanding popular culture and how popular culture works with us as a reflection of society and how we play a part in the construction of these ideas within popular culture. This is a performance from Algira in Newark. I don't know if anyone knows about this space, but I was invited. Usually when I'm invited to do a project, is usually when a performance happens for me. I usually don't propose exhibitions or propose performances unless the space is interested in doing something very experimental that is not necessarily an art object, but in some way connecting people with the space outside of the space. This particular piece is called the Holdout, and it's an installation piece with a radio station built in. And this is the first installation I did with a radio station. And part of the structure was to create this installation, and inside of this structure was an operating radio station with different guest hosts. So the guest hosts I invited were mostly artists, but also people from the community. It was open to the public, and people just came and sat in the tent with me while I played, and if they were interested in hosting, I gave them a day to host. It was very open. It wasn't a lot of structure with what to talk about or how to talk about anything, but it was really more about using my position as an artist to help the community to have a voice. Because like I was saying, everyone is performing. Everyone's a performer. Just some people don't really have a platform or know what their performance is really consists of until they actually have an opportunity to speak, to engage, to contribute. This actual performance, every time I do a performance, it shows me a lot about just myself as an artist. How do I work with people? How do I execute my ideas? How effective they are to the audience? This is a performance from the kitchen, 2012. It's called Go Stay Next to the Mountain. When I was invited to do a performance at the kitchen, this is another type of performance. It's an audience, it's a stage, it's a performance space. This was actually the first performance space I was invited to do a piece. So I had to really consider the performance space as part of the performance. Normally in performances, I've always been more excited about the engagement of the audience on a very accessible level, where my pieces have always been on the ground, in the gallery, or in the space where people can just walk up into the sculpture or into my performance and become part of the performance. But when I was invited to do the piece at the kitchen, I had to really think about how to structure a performance in relationship to a performance space without really leaning towards the traditional structure of performance, which is the audience is up here and I'm right here. I wanted to create a performance where I was very accessible, if not physically, psychologically, to the audience, where they feel they can actually connect with me on a really personal level. So this particular performance is called Go Stay Next to the Mountain, like I was saying before. It's more of a musical related performance with video. Some speaking components, but it was a very lyrical performance with original score that was created in collaboration with Philippe Troy, who's a classical composer. This is an image from the performance. These are videos, which I usually include. The thing is about performance for me, which I think is very interesting in the direction of performance now, and being aware of social media as an artist of this generation, we're overstimulated. We're able to have a phone, a laptop, and whatever, and look at TV at the same time, without being necessarily distracted in any way. And I like that. I like that we're able to do a lot of different things and be effective at them all. Some people can. And so when I make performances, I'm considering the way people see now, not the way people saw 10 years ago or 15 years ago. So when I make performances in certain spaces, I believe in the oversaturation of imagery. So when I'm doing a performance like this at the kitchen, I also included an overhead projector that played simultaneously with the live performance that was not behind me, but above me. So all these things with music, video, live action, all these things happening in the space for 45 minutes straight. I never left the stage. The lights never went dim. The sculpture that I made right here was on wheels. So basically, every angle of the sculpture was a backdrop. So when the video stopped, the sculpture was in transition, and the next performance happened. There was also a DJ turntable on the top of the sculpture, and at one part of the sculpture, I crawled inside and came up to the top and played music. And this piece is called The Mountain Speaks. This is another performance piece at PS1 Dome, and this was a piece that was inspired by music as well. It's called The Entertainer. This was also an audience, artist-audience situation, more on a performative level. This particular performance right here is called Feeding with a Long Spoon. It's a really exciting performance for me because it was really about an intimate setting in the gallery, in the middle of an audience. I was invited to participate in the gallery and create a performance, and I thought what would be great is to have an intimate moment with a close friend in the gallery while people watched. And what's more intimate than having dinner? I created these sculptures. They were spears based on my utensils at home, and we fed each other across from each other in the middle of the space. And usually I don't normally use a lot of professional performers because there's a certain level of consciousness or over consciousness that happens with people who are trained as performers versus some people who are just natural and nervous and scared. The audience can feel that, and I think that makes people feel more present. So when I make performances, I try to really consider even the people who participate with me as a way of making it as real and as vulnerable and connected as possible with the audience. This particular piece, Feeding with a Long Spoon, was a 30-minute performance, and the components were four servings, appetizers, main course, dessert, and something else. I don't know what it was, I forgot. But in between those 5 minutes of eating, there were channel surfing that was projected above us as a moment of reflection before we went to the next course. And before, with the piece I did called The Channel, this was also part of the structure of the video playing, the interlude playing in between the live action performance. And these are the images from some performers that participated in that piece. And this is the order in which the performance started and ended. This is also part of the performance where I recreated a Muppet based on a previous Muppet that existed in 1976 called Roosevelt Franklin. He existed for 1 year, a Sesame Street puppet, and I wanted to recreate him for this performance because part of the structure of performing, and I'm really aware of the structure of performance as an aesthetic. So if I'm going to perform in a theater, I'm going to make it theatrical. I'm going to use that structure to communicate. I'm going to use the lighting and the way people walk into the theater, the way the programs are placed. Those things are really important for the structure and the communication of the performance in the audience. Those things to me are not things that you want to change. I don't want to change them. I want people to be aware of the structure, be aware of the drama, be aware of how you connect with the subject matter through their pre-existing structure of theater and performance. This is a private performance. This is a series. All these things I really do simultaneously. All these performances are things that I'm doing at the same time. I may do a public performance 1 week, and then next week I may do a private performance, I call, where I just go into a space and just do like an action and record it and become like a photographic documentation or a video project. This particular piece is called Communicating with Shadows. And this is the last of the images. And this particular performance was based on my relationship from influence as an artist from other artists that I respected and followed. I wanted to have a visual conversation about history, a visual conversation about relationships, legacy, conflict. So for this particular performance, I decided to go through the archive and find all the artists that I that I follow and all the artists that I studied and create these silhouettes based on documentation. This particular image is from Blizzard Ball, David Hammond's. What I did is went through archives of images of different artists, removed them from their background, and created a gigantic silhouette with an overhead projector. And I used that image as a stage for my performance, where once I stepped into their shadow, I responded to one of their previous performances, creating a new performance from that. Once I left the shadow, the performance was over. This is another series of photos from that series with Jim Henson. This is the first time Jim Henson was on TV at Sam and Friends, and he introduced Yuri, one of the first of its kind, and that's a big influence on my work. I believe in performance taking various structures. I don't really subscribe to one particular structure. It's really about the messenger. The messenger is part of the performance. The messenger is very important in the way that the performance and the message in the performance is received. So it can take a form of a spoon or a puppet, a music score, an intimate setting, a big party, a radio station, a board game. It could be anything. But the success of all those things is the conversation that happens within those things. And if the audience communicates or at least gets something from it that's relatable to your idea behind it, that's a successful performance. And you've actually wrapped your idea in a fantastic aesthetic. This is an image of Joseph Beuys. And this is an image of Wile E. Coyote. And for some of you guys who know, it's from the documentation of I Like America and America Likes Me. Thank you.
Like my predecessors in this, can you hear me okay? On this spot, I just want to say I, too, am so grateful to have been included in this conference. Sometimes the theater people are included in a conference because the theater person can be counted on to be the court jester of any intellectual proceeding. But I realize that is not the case at this conference. So thank you for that as well. I've learned so much here, and we'll continue to for the rest of the day. This paper is an account of sorts of what has been a theoretical debate over aesthetics in theater studies, which is a field not much given to debate since the 200-year quarrel between the ancients and the moderns that was settled in the 18th century. And the paper also has a title, somewhat long title. And this is the title. As my friend and colleague at Harvard, Martin Puchner, has said, I blame Aristotle for everything. Or, how postmodern got pushed off stage by post-dramatic until Aristotle, the Phantom, and the Wings upstaged them both. Okay. Part 1, postmodern theater. In the late 70s and 80s, postmodern caught on as a label in all the arts, beginning with architecture, spreading to the performing arts, first dance, then finally theater. It was a label best understood through the lens of post-structuralist French theory, especially deconstruction. The term postmodern concerned not only the dramatic text, but theater's entire mise-en-scène, and seemed to have considerable explanatory power when held up to the relatively new art of performance that had begun to arise in the previous decade in the work of major American theater artists such as the Becks and Joseph Chaikin, then Meredith Monk, Richard Foreman, Lee Brewer, Elizabeth LeCompte, and above all, Robert Wilson. These artists worked with major design elements and large groups of performers, so their work looked like theater, and we said that they produced performance pieces. Whereas the work produced on bare stages, often by single performers, came to be called performance art. Sometimes we said art performance. Sometimes we said alternative or experimental theater. In a pinch, we could always fall back on avant-garde. Postmodernism was taken up by the mainstream press, and it wore out from overuse like Romanticism in the early 19th century. Used up. I should know, I wrote a book about it. It seemed to refer to a philosophical world outside of known theater aesthetics. But in the theater, it was misunderstood. Deconstruction was frequently equated with destruction, and was rarely understood as it should have been as the disassembling or the leveling of binaries and hierarchies, much less as indicating a kind of nostalgia for earlier forms that had been rejected by higher modernism. All of this I know you folks know. Meanwhile, the rise and popularity of this kind of theater was entirely unaffected by definitional confusion. The abyss of postmodern staging might have been reached with the birth of the poet in the Next Wave Festival at the Brooklyn Academy of Music in 1985, in which texts by Kathy Acker, setting by the visual artist David Sell, music by David Gordon, were experimentally developed entirely separated without any contact with each other. And then they were simply put on stage by the theater director, Richard Foreman, without any intended relationship. And this performance was well known, for one thing, for being greeted with vocal rage by those spectators who hung on to the end. Part 2, post-dramatic theater. In 1999, the book Post-Dramatic Theater by German theater theorist Hans Thies Lehmann was published in Germany. And Lehmann was, among other things, a Brecht theorist and had his major teaching career in Frankfurt. But the period that preceded this book, in this period that preceded this book, he was crucially a teacher at the Institute for Applied, I'm translating this, for Applied Theater Studies at Gießen. And this institute was in part inspired by the American performance studies, by the American performance studies model, pioneered in this country by Richard Schechner at NYU and Dwight Conquergood at Northwestern. The true German experimental theater of today owes its development to this institute. It seems to have been at Gießen, at the Gießen time, that Lehmann was most impressed by the work of the American director Robert Wilson. And Wilson was more produced and embraced in Germany than in his own country and his own state of Texas. The still living surrealist Louis Aragon, who I think saw Wilson's work in France, wrote an open letter to his dead friend, André Breton, saying that in Wilson's work, the theater they had always imagined for surrealism had finally been realized. The term post-dramatic, even more than its traits, the term more than its traits anatomized in the book, was immediately embraced by the Central European theater community, then more widely embraced in Europe, and is now globally recognized. The book has appeared in about 20 different languages, including several Asian translations, and has taken over the academic discourse, even if it's not a term that's all that well known still by the general public. It appeared in a somewhat abridged English translation in 2006. Part 3, Peter Zondi. Lehmann was the last doctoral student of the Hungarian literary theorist Peter Zondi, whose work was done principally in Berlin. Best known in English for his 1956 dissertation, Theory of the Modern Drama, which in turn finds its roots in Lukács's Theory of the Novel, and before him in Hegel. In it, Zondi proposes an archaeology of the dramatic form, which in his view didn't become entirely dramatic until it found its form entirely in interpersonal dialogue sometime in the 17th century, let's say with Racine. This part sounds arcane, but this is the most important part. This is an alert, most important part. In its pre-dramatic mode, Zondi's argument goes, from the Greeks to the Middle Ages through the Elizabethans, the theatrical text still employed non-dialogic modalities, such as the chorus and the prologue and the epilogue and the monologue and the aside, and therefore it wasn't entirely dramatic. But in the 17th century, the dramatic text fully embraces the dialogic form, becoming what Zondi called absolute drama. And this absolute drama represented a cultural decision, if you will, that everything important to human discourse could be embraced through dialogue. Nothing that was important to our life on this earth, there was nothing that could not be expressed through dialogue, according to Zondi. And that includes God and the devil. This stage, he argued, really no longer spoke to God and the devil, and God and the devil did not speak through the stage anymore. Zondi is entirely ignored in American academic theater culture. We would be put out of business if we taught our students that the Greeks and Shakespeare didn't write dramas. And that's too bad in a way. I mean, Zondi is very interesting, and this perspective, I can't say that it's discarded, because I think the Americans and maybe the Brits too are just really not familiar with the work. Anyhow, to continue his argument, for the better part of 3 centuries, the post-dramatic argument goes, drama is satisfied with what I'm calling this dialogic compromise, until it begins to break down towards the end of the 19th century. This process, Zondi called, after Brecht and after Lukács, epicization. I'm not going to digress on what epicization means, and probably you know. Anyhow, Zondi tragically committed suicide in 1971, and it was his last doctoral student who completed his project. This is where post-dramatic comes from. To Zondi's pre-drama, Lehmann now adds a post-drama. And so we have a tripartite structure, right? We have pre-drama, we have drama, 3 centuries almost, and then we have post-drama. But this drama of Lehmann's is not only post-dialogic, but it's in some sense post-textual. It's more concerned with performed theater than the written form of drama, and this is an important addition. In this theater, the text, sometimes appearing only in fragments, takes its place as only one constituent of many among lights, color, music, and other previously hierarchic Aristotelian elements. To this process of theatrical, let's call it theatrical democratization, Lehmann gives the Greek term parataxis, a grammatical term meaning to place things side by side without subordination or coordination. If you remember my example of The Birth of the Parrot, this was also the prime trait of postmodern theater. But then, maybe both of them owe more to modernist collage than they were willing to recognize. Lehman most importantly expanded Zondi's focus on the dramatic text to seeing stage and theater as one interactive organism. And of course, I was so interested to hear Derek say the same thing about his own performances. Gone in the new theater is what HTL, Hans-T. Lehman, calls the fictive cosmos on one side of the curtain, and the passive audience on the other side of the curtain, separated by Wagner's mystic gulf. In the new theater, the post-dramatic theater, there is a live exchange in the moment, creating an important word to Lehman, situations of the, quote, real. This is not Lacan's real, it's not Ibsen's realism or Zola's naturalism, but the real of immediate and unpredictable interaction between stage and house. The notorious incident of the coupling of naked bodies of actors and spectators in the Living Theater's New Haven performance of Paradise Now in 1968 and its aftermath of street incidents and arrests is perhaps the most real of this genre. But it hangs on to this day in empty gestures, as I just saw it a couple of weeks ago when Lev Dodin of Russia's Mali Theater had his actors in Chekhov's Cherry Orchard invade the audience by entering and exiting the stage through the aisles of the house. And that kind of gesture is today is about as real as the $3 bill and less rare. And I do think that Hans-T. Lehman, too, would reject it. Part 4, the end of drama. Like a huge magnet, the term post-dramatic conceptually pulled together all the post-conventional theater forms of the past half-century into a single broad movement. There was like this huge recognition scene that went through theater of all different kinds when artists kind of looked at each other and said, oh, this is what we've been doing. It's post-dramatic, of course. It doesn't matter whether it's a small thing in a performance space or it's a new production of Hamlet. It's all post-dramatic. This new poetics of contemporary theater practice was immediately legible to the Western theater world because it could be comprehended as taking place. This is the second most important thing. It could be understood as taking its place in the great lineage of dramatic theory begun with Aristotle's commentary on Athenian tragedy. Nobody could say that about postmodern. Nobody could say that about Derrida. What did he have to do with this whole Aristotelian lineage? He did, of course, but, the theater people didn't know. We in theater are a field that has never thrown off, and seemingly can never throw off, the theatrical aesthetics of Aristotle, though we often claim to do so or to have done so. And these aesthetics are as influential in their defiance of, as in their disregard of, as in their observance of what the French Academy famously called the rules. We learned from them that plot is at the head of the tragic hierarchy, followed by character, and concluded at the very end of this six-part structure by the visual, by scene. We learned from Hegel that the order was wrong, that it was character first, then plot. We learned from Brecht that a focus on plot and character, now one word, was the sentimental empathy of culinary theater. We learned from Hans-T. Lehman that even Brecht was culinary in the sense of continuing to cultivate a fictive cosmos. So when his book came out, we wondered, well, was it finally it? Was this it for drama? Was post-dramatic really the end of the Aristotelian trajectory? Well, there were those who wanted to use postmodernism a long time ago to drive a stake through the heart of conventional theatrical realism. What made that prospective death plausible at the time was the idea that theater was changing and had to change in tandem with what we took to be broad cultural transformation in the real world. New realities would be expressed in these new forms, and new forms would be grasped and embraced and intuitively understood because cognition itself was changing in this new world. But unlike postmodern, unlike postmodern, within the world which thought it understood transformation, post-dramatic understands change as a dynamic within a genre. I'm not sure I said that very clearly. Postmodern aspired to see the stage reflect transformation within the world, and post-dramatic describes it as a dynamic of change within a genre of theater. Here's the last part, Aristotle's revenge. Theater has often been behind the other arts in embracing a new aesthetic, perhaps because it is such a collaborative art form and it comes burdened with too many consent forms. You know, everybody has to agree. Stage managers have to agree. The sound designer has to agree. When we think about other attempts to oppose or undermine foundational principles in the arts, we remember pictorial abstraction as at one time signaling the death of figurative art. We remember serialism as signaling the death of the death of tonality. We remember parole and libertà and Zaum as signaling the end of the systematic organization of language into narrative. And we have seen how those attempts appeared to be the wave of the future of those arts until they weren't. And finally, we've seen that those radical modernist departures were reabsorbed into the process of adaptation of those arts and have now become available methods in arts that have brought back the tonal and the figurative and narrative. So Lehmann could have been documenting the end of an art form as we know it, or knew it, but he could have been observing a late eruption into the theater of the century-old performance techniques that emerged with avant-garde modernism at the turn of the 20th century. Except then, the futurist synthesi, or the Dada performances, were not really considered theater art at all. And let me say, when I went to graduate school, they were never taught as part of theater. They were really taught as a kind of adjunct of visual art somehow. They belonged to museums. And I can't resist adding that it is one of the great switcheroos of the American art scene that performance is back in the museums. First is authoritative restaging of what we'd seen 20 years earlier in the theater, as in the case of Marina Abramovich. But now museums are now creating their new performance. Every museum has to have, I don't mean this in relation to anything that you said, I want to say this. but I mean, museums are in it seems to me museums are in a frantic competition to be competitive by adding performance to their visual menus. Avant-garde experimentation in the theater really decisively occurred when American theater artists of the late 60s and 70s, early 80s, picked up and continued, this is my view, I'm not citing anybody about in saying this, picked up and continued Europe's unfinished avant-garde project in the theater, interrupted by the war. But the leading American artists of that epoch have lapsed back towards more narrative theater. The Worcester Group does Hamlet and Phaedra. Robert Wilson does Brecht and Strindberg. Lee Brewer does Ibsen. Ivan von Hove does Arthur Miller. The Elevator Repair Service does The Great Gatsby. And of course, they do them in a highly imaginative, deconstructed, interesting way. But still, these texts perform they have the armature of these texts. A fictive cosmos is a hard thing to kill. From an American perspective now, younger directors and groups do not seem to be carrying the insights of 50 years ago farther, like Kansas City. They've gone about as far as they can go. In fact, conventional plot and character plays are being celebrated in New York this year, and regressive realist family drama aesthetics are emerging as the newest thing. The methods described in the Handbook of Post-Dramatic Aesthetics, that is the core of Lehman's post-dramatic theater book, are now being reabsorbed into the slow-moving, adaptable forms of bourgeois theater, so it seems to me. And even in Germany, from which emanated so much theatrical excitement, say 20 years ago, even in Germany, all that post-excitement, the excitement of post, is somewhat post. Thank you.
So I have to give a good disclaimer first. I am presuming to talk about a trajectory in aesthetics with philosophers in the audience. I'm an amateur philosopher, so the way that I'm talking about it, I just want to make clear I know it is filtered through my art historical training, and it's really meant to be as such. So I'm talking about, very briefly at the beginning here, I'll be talking about Kant, mostly through the lens of how it's been received in art history. So part one, modernism's antipathy to the contingent, art, aesthetics, and European modernity. Beginning with Burke and his philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas of the sublime and the beautiful around 1750, as you see, he was quite open to the idea of pleasure being a response to art. Who is stranger to that manner of expression so common in all times and in all countries of being softened, relaxed, enervated, dissolved, melted away by pleasure? With the rise of revolutionary politics and the refining of Enlightenment thought, we have a shift to a model of aesthetics based on removing sensual pleasure. And again, extremely schematic. I'm just pulling out a few points here. So by 1790, partly in order to legitimate aesthetic judgment as equal to rational pursuits, Immanuel Kant was articulating an anti-sensual model of aesthetics that 20th century theorists, of course, would extend and simplify in modernist formalism. Kant established the basis for aesthetic judgment, which still functions in art history and criticism, and I'm ready to argue that point later, based on the key idea that the interpreter or critic is disinterested, even though, of course, we don't use that word anymore. The idea that the critic is unbiased and simply discerning the true meaning and value of the work. As many have pointed out, including myself, this model, as carried into modernist and contemporary criticism, gives authority to the critic by disavowing his or her interests. What Kant was doing, of course, in part, was debunking previous philosophers who claimed aesthetic judgment to be purely subjective and sensual. The Critique of Judgment section on aesthetics is an attempt to legitimate judgment of art by placing it as high as reason. Kant was very radical at the time in doing this. He raised up aesthetic judgment within the values of the time. So according to Kant, while judgments of the good and agreeable bond the subject to the real existence of the object, aesthetic judgments or judgments of taste are simply contemplative and indifferent as to the existence of objects. Of course, many theorists have related this idea and other ideas at the time to the formation of the kind of modernist meta-narrative, but also the figure of the coherent European subject, which are connected to assertions of universality linked to the legacy of colonialism and imperialism at work in European culture at that time. So aesthetics became a way of substantiating the authority of a particular kind of subject. Theorists such as Luc Ferry, Hans-Georg Gadamer, and William Peets have argued that aesthetics is part of the constitution of the modern subject, again, linked to colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism, which were beginning to burgeon and crystallize these formations. Taken reductively, Kant's arguments did not themselves construct, but supported a conception of the subject, implicitly male, white, middle class, and franchised, as capable of objective judgment, detached and coherent within himself, untouched by sensual desires or any interest in the aesthetic object or elements of its representation. Kant makes very interesting arguments about universality, stating, for example, the subject feels himself completely free in respect of the liking which he accords to the object. Hence, he must regard it as resting on what he may also presuppose in every other person. And therefore, he must believe that he has reason for demanding a similar delight from everyone. Accordingly, he will speak of the beautiful as if beauty were a quality of the object and the judgment logical. So it's that as if that the modernist formalist chose to disregard. So here he states the judgment of taste itself does not postulate the agreement of everyone, it only imputes this agreement to everyone. And not on the basis of concepts, but from the concurrence of others. The universal voice is only an idea. The assertion is not that everyone will fall in with our judgment, but rather that everyone ought to agree with it. So, of course, universalism becomes embedded in European-based cultures, such that it's become kind of embedded, I think, in all of the ways we still think about art. And these are very loaded images. I'm not going into them, but there's obviously a reason that's there. However, of course, the problem with universalism is illustrated by Hegel's point in his lectures on aesthetics. Defectiveness of form arises from defectiveness of content. For example, the Chinese, Indian, and Egyptians, in their artistic shapes, their forms of deities, and their idols, never got beyond a formless phase, one of a vicious and false definiteness of form, and were unable to attain genuine beauty. That's the universalism of European judgment. This aspect of aesthetics has, of course, been deeply challenged by postmodern culture, postmodern art, and post-structuralist theory, all of which are part and parcel of the activism of the rights movements, and that's a really important point for me. So if we look at Gadamer, he argues that under postmodernism or the post-colonial situation, the subject becomes destabilized. There's kind of both things going on in Gadamer. There's a little bit of a maintenance of what I would call a modernist idea in unity, but at the same time he's very clear that art is not a timeless present that presents itself to a pure aesthetic consciousness, but the act of a mind and spirit that has collected and gathered itself historically. Our experience of the aesthetic is a mode of self-understanding, which has to do with someone other than the self. And we'll see a lot of artists kind of enacting this idea, not because they've read Gadamer, but because they're thinking in the same way. And they are enacting works that are performative and relational from the 1950s onward. So then we get to post-structuralism. In Economimesis, published in 1981, and Truth in Painting, published in French in 1978 and in English in 1987, Jacques Derrida teases out the contradictions in Kant's model, noting that Kant wants the work of art to be completely self-contained, such that the parergon or frame marks off the exterior from the interior clearly. In Economimesis, Derrida notes that Kant's model is covertly tied to capitalist logic in that free art is opposed to paid or mercenary art. He argues, Derrida, that art is to raise man up and to avoid contamination from below in these theories of aesthetics. The idea of art, he argues, relies on framing and signature while extensively excluding those from the supposedly inherent value. The idea of art secures its value through a disembodied recourse to a transcendent godlike authority, which validates the genius origins of the work. In this model, vision is given the greatest nobility. Again, this is still Derrida, as the other senses pollute and threaten the coherent subject of European modernity. He concludes, the non-transcendentalizable, the non-idealizable, the non-aestheticizable is the disgusting side of embodiment, the absolute excluded. You can probably see where I'm moving towards here. Frames, again, that became intrinsic to the work itself in the Baroque period and caryatids, as illustrated in Truth in Painting, and he never comments directly on these, but they're clearly exemplifying the ways in which there is no clean inside-outside division, that the disgust that is supposedly expelled always already infiltrates the work of art. So there's a constituent failure to contain or frame and secure universalism in aesthetic judgment. While the Kantian aesthetic seeks, according to Derrida, to purge the messiness of embodiment, including intersubjectivity and the vicissitudes of interestedness or desire from art and aesthetics, Derrida laboriously points out how failed this project of exclusion is. And there's a very interesting article by Diane Rodowicz kind of continuing and amplifying on Derrida's points called Impure Mimesis. This is the final ground for the essential disinterestedness of aesthetic judgments in order to say that an object is beautiful and to demonstrate that the philosopher has pure taste. Everything returns to the meaning that the subject can give to the representation, excluding any factor that would make the subject dependent on the real existence of the object. It is this exclusion that the younger generation of artists emerging in the 50s and 60s reject. And in fact, as Terry Eagleton wrote, of course, much later in The Ideology of the Aesthetic, aesthetics is born as a discourse of the body. In fact, we could argue that everything Kant wants to argue about that exclusion of disgust is argued precisely because we can't exclude it. He wouldn't need to say that if it were already not part of how we have to always approach visual objects or whatever we want to apply aesthetic judgment to. I want to say then that artists implicitly or intuitively understood that to radicalize what was becoming stuck in modernist formalism, they needed to return the body to the picture, and of course they needed to put time back into the aesthetic relationship. Part 2, art critics in high modernism, performativity, durationality, embodiment as threat. I'm going to go through this really quickly because I'm assuming that most of you probably know all the arguments against Greenberg and Fried. So they're, in a way, kind of self-evident in a way that might be problematic by now, and I am kind of caricaturing the complexities just for the point of polemic. Greenberg's model of modernism was explicitly oculocentric, as Caroline Jones has argued in Eyesight Alone. Greenberg stated, quote, "Where the old masters created an illusion of space into which one could imagine walking, the illusion created by a modernist is one into which one can look, can travel only with the eye," etc. So in Greenberg's model, there is a continual attempt to remove the body, to compress temporality, and color field painting becomes the epitome of this transcendent formalist modernist conception of art. And of course, with Michael Fried, he takes these concepts to almost a degree I might call hysterical in the famous Art and Objecthood, where his really his like passionate, revulsive language around minimalism is extremely useful because it's so extreme. But I think he also brilliantly describes exactly what minimalism was doing to the modernist aesthetic. Of course, he just gets the value of it wrong, so to speak. I mean, at least as historically the judgment has occurred. So he takes Robert Morris's writing and he parodies it almost in Art and Objecthood. So he says minimalism is, or what he calls literalist art, is not full within itself. Minimal art is placed within a new genre of theater. Again, Eleanor would have interesting things to say about why that's so damning for a modernist to say. And this is a negation of art. It's corrupted or perverted by theater. He repeats himself a lot with increasingly hyperbolic language. The experience of literalist art is of an object in a situation, you know, one that virtually by definition includes the beholder. The success, even the survival of the arts has come increasingly to depend on their ability to defeat theater. Art degenerates as it approaches the condition of theater. The concept of quality and value and the concept of art itself are meaningful or wholly meaningful only within the individual arts. What lies between the arts is theater. I could go on, but the point is he connects theater, which historically has long in art discourse been connected with femininity and homosexuality. I have a lot of sources on that, if anyone's interested. So it's also a move that could be seen as a reaction to the rise of identity politics, to the kinds of deep questioning and even violent activist questioning of the kinds of standards and assumed norms that lie behind this kind of critical model of disinterestedness. Minimalism is degraded because it opens up temporality, durationality, demands an awareness of the contingency of the body self of the viewer and interpreter. For Fried, temporality and contingency must be suspended and disavowed from the aesthetic experience. In contrast, minimalism introduces repetition, duration, and awareness of embodiment and the durationality of experience. And he's quite explicit on that point. Now, Robert Morris, of course, says in his well-known 1966 article written just before this on minimalism, the experience of the work necessarily exists in time. So this was, Fried is explicitly responding to the claims made by Robert Morris. Now, it's always mystifying when I'm teaching this to undergraduates that, like, for Fried, this is the great work of art, whereas minimalism is this horrible, evil opening to theater, and they're always like, I don't get it. They look kind of like the same thing. And those moments with people who aren't already inside of these debates are really great, because you realize, yeah, they have a good point there. So the constructedness of that value system is really so evident, I think, especially retrospectively. So for Fried, good sculpture defeats theater, et cetera, et cetera. So where we are then is the theatrical or performative as dangerously feminizing or queer as threatening modernist aesthetics. And I have Jack Smith hovering in the background there. In the post-1960 period, in spite or perhaps partly because of Fried, we see an increasing interest in returning to a much more subtle version of aesthetics, foregrounding the Kantian self-reflexive awareness that interpretation is always already contingent, embodied, durational, and that universality is an idea, not an actuality. So there's a much larger argument here as to how we might think about the confluence of the concept of theatricality or durationality or embodiment as somehow connected to performativity and queerness. And this is part of my next book project, historiographically exploring the development of the notions of queer and the notions of the performative, both of which come to develop as we know them today in the post-World War II period. But for today, let me just say, and I have a few more pages here, if modernism stopped time, then younger generations of theorists and artists, again, intuitively or explicitly understood that they needed to activate time. They needed to expose the relationality between the work and the body. And this happens as early as the early 50s with Rauschenberg and others working together at Black Mountain. It's no accident that by the early 60s you have Susan Sontag writing on camp. You have Richard Schechner saying some very homophobic things, actually, about the unfortunate incursion of homosexuality into theater. It's no accident that you have artists more and more frequently posing themselves and performing themselves in either advertisements or in their works during this period. And I've written, of course, a book about body art as part of that development. And so there's an interesting intertwining of a concept of camp, homosexuality, theatricality, performativity, performance, that really starts to explode in the 1960s. And of course, Andy Warhol is paradigmatic of that moment with his many, many comments explicitly outing himself as a gay man and talking about his swish demeanor in relation to abstract expressionism. The Sontag quote is just to remind us of this. It's a very complicated moment. There's a lot of different things going on, some of which have to do with a kind of broader popular culture idea of camp, and others of which have to do with the art world. But the point I want to make is that there's a link between the rise of theatricality or performativity and the rights and post-colonial movements, a desire to open art as experience, to make it clear that meaning and value are reciprocal. There's an explicit politics to opening art and aesthetics to theatricality, performativity, and the specificity of bodies making and interpreting art. Of course, there's a coming together of dance, theater, and performance, particularly in New York in the 60s. And again, this is so schematic, I could be here for hours. I love this stuff, but I'm just going to race through it and then maybe in questions. You know, people like Morris explicitly claiming time as being an element even with these sculptural objects. Carolee Schneemann explicitly claiming the importance of embodiment as a way of activating that reciprocity of meaning. The crossover of feminist dance practices and minimalism, the crossover of underground performance, queer aesthetics. Again, radical underground performance in film. So just in the end then, and I'm trying to be very quick, but I don't want to skip these pieces at the end, which are kind of artists dealing with the legacy of how to thwart the freezing capacity of modernist criticism as it tends to either erase bodies through claims of transcendence, and of course that would be the kind of Barnett-Newman abstract expressionist model, or to freeze bodies in place, allowing viewers to forget our own embodiment at the cost of others' bodies and selves. And the trajectory of fetishism within Western art is a key element here. And so then, this is the kind of work that I want to end with. Someone like Renee Cox, and interestingly, these aren't live performances. These are performative, I would say, kind of self-imaging, which we know through photographs. She's taking that legacy of the freezing of the living body of the colonized other, and she's, instead of allowing that to remain a kind of frozen past image, she is re-dynamizing it through, of course, through appropriation and parody. I can never show enough Renee Cox works. They're so great. I've never met her, so you can introduce me. But these images, I think, are just so fantastic in the directness through which they're cutting into that freezing tendency. And then, of course, you can go through the history of works, most often actually by people who were oppressed and who were enacting themselves through the empowerment of the rights movements, who are, again, performing the body as relational, vulnerable, and opening us to our own contingency by revivifying those relationships. This one I'm not so sure about, actually. I was double thinking putting this in. And I thought Derek's point about being vulnerable as a person of color and how you're always, like, whether you like it or not, in this culture kind of performing that, and how some artists decide to put that in the foreground of what they're doing, whether it's Renee or James Luna, who's literalizing the tendency to position Native American cultural expression as artifact, which goes back to that discussion yesterday, by putting his body in the vitrine at the Museum of Man, so to speak, in San Diego. And, you know, visitors are coming and they're taken aback to realize this is an actual living Indian and that Native Americans actually are still around and living. And it's a very simple point, but it enacts the way in which performance can open up those relational bonds and refuse those kinds of freezing that occur in modernist theory. And I want that image of the actual cervix from you, Maureen, because this is all I have.
I had that one first and then I changed it.
Yeah, that's a goodie. But again, you know, these all relate kind of directly to the history of fetishism, and that I decided just to pull out that one strand because that's one of the most powerful ways in which bodies can be frozen and objectified, of course, in Western art and popular culture. So all of these artists are in one way or another defreezing by making you look at the cervix. Here now, Bustamante is inviting all the white men in the audience or anyone channeling a white man to come and eat her penis burrito while she makes a comment about the problematic nature of the Cinquacentennial celebrations in 1992. This is a great piece. And it, again, really activates by making herself vulnerable, but also kind of turning the tables and making the white man, which is de-essentialized, making anyone going up also vulnerable, of course, because you're being looked at as you're doing this ridiculous thing. Ron Athey, I'm doing a lot of work on his work, so he's here making himself extremely vulnerable and inviting audience members to do caretaking. Zachary Drucker, this very beautiful piece with Zachary speaking in voiceover from a taped kind of monologue, and then having people come and pluck all of her hairs off in a kind of enactment of her transition, her gender transition. And I'll just end with returning to 18th century aesthetics through the work of Paul Donald, who does this performance where he covers himself in white, and it's actually white stage makeup, to become the kind of glowing, preternatural whiteness that we see in this rare moment of European art where they allowed males' bodies to be the objects of desire, and basically enacting himself in that place, which becomes a place of vulnerability through the performance. So I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Wow, we have a lot to talk about. So, but I have to just say before, I just want to go straight to questions and hopefully a dialogue with everyone here. I just want to say that I'm especially delighted that you talked about Michael Fried, because I think he would be so happy that I am here representing the sculpture department, talking about performance, and a lot of our sculpture students are doing performance pieces. So, I think we're over it, Michael. Okay, so...
He was a prophet.
He was a prophet.
Well,
I had a different view of his prophet.
Yeah, I mean, I just don't want to give him that much credit.
Okay,
because
fair enough.
Basically, Robert Morris had already said everything he said. It's just that he took it and made it very polemic so that it was picked up on.
Questions? Where are the mics? Can you raise your hand if you have a question, and then a microphone will make its way to you.
I'm curious about Lehrman's book's popularity, because it seems to me that what Lehrman is doing is a fundamentally modernist and structuralist take that erases or minimalizes the experience of the viewer, exactly what is being called theatricality by Fried, and what is so present in Derek's work in the museum, where it seems like the experience is paramount to the work, and the interaction with the work is what is going on. And it's also quite different from Ellie's own work in The Death of Character. Lehrman basically erases interest in gender, in the body, and goes back to an extremely conservative structural approach to the elements of drama, not going back before post-structuralism, it seems, and without any taking into account of phenomenological responses or the activity, the experiential nature of the theatrical event. And so my question to Ellie is why has this become so popular in the academy at this particular moment? And to what can we account of this kind of odd erasure of the work of the 1980s and 90s and thinking about the theatrical experience, whether positively or negatively.
This is a question addressed to me.
Yeah, and anyone else who wants to talk about it.
Well, first of all, I'm going to out you. This is my dear friend John Amy from Brown, and when my book, The Death of Character, was published, 96, I think, Brown was and John, they were the first people to invite me to come up and speak about it. So Brown had expressed a long interest in this subject. Well, you know, I thought that was the subject of my talk, and I may be wrong, but this lineage that he describes, on the one hand, it can seem quite radical. Well, you know, drama's over, and also drama never existed in a time when we thought it was established. But on the other hand, that very three-part structure is really returning us, even in its rejection, to traditional theater aesthetics. Whereas that earlier period that you're talking about was trying to escape it. Of course, one can mordantly say, you know, that didn't escape either, but it was a time of great excitement to make that effort to look at something that seemed to be really, I have to stress seemed, to be new on the planet. So you may have some other thoughts about this popularity. I mean, it's extraordinary in a way that this, particularly in its English translation, which is simply post-dramatic theater, it's not well translated, and great chunks of this long book were just left out, not really acknowledged by Routledge, the publisher, that there were omissions of that dimension. And then every once in a while, the translator would put something in, and that wasn't annotated as being the translator's remark. So the book is a little confusing. But I think, you know, really because a fictive cosmos is a hard thing to kill, I think the book completes a certain theoretical narrative that people have been looking for ever since we got into theater's expression of modernism. So it's satisfying, you know what I mean? In a way that postmodernism never was. That's as much as I can say about it. You may know more.
Thank you for a wonderful panel. Amelia, I have a question for you. I think it's wonderful how you fill in the notion of the queer, I think, through these notions of performativity and specificity, the specificity of embodiment and contingency and theatricality, especially in light of the history in queer theory, where the notion of queer emerged, according to some readings, with Teresa de Lauritis in the 80s, and then Butler picking up on it. So relatively late with respect to some of the history you're tracing. So that raises for me a question about the contingency of the notion of the queer vis-à-vis the art history you're tracing. And it also raises a question about that contingency specifically, given that the notion of the queer at that moment emerged really as a form of normative unsettlement of both the gay and the lesbian, the homonormative, and of heterosexualist forms of subjectivity. So there was this very emphatic association of the queer with a form of unsettlement and a form of critique, a form of anti-normativity, even something that contemporary theorists are getting away from. But I just wonder where you stand vis-a-vis that, because I don't see you particularly re-essentializing the queer through this list of notions But I'm just wondering if you identify the queer then primarily with a kind of still unsettlement of the freed type of figuration, modernist figuration of the body, or how you would precisely locate it.
That's really a great question, and I'm at the point with this project where I'm kind of caught between doing this historiography where what I'm talking about kind of does emerge in the 50s, so a kind of opening up of the performativity of the self, often by marginalized, putatively self-identified gay and lesbian people. Not that it never occurs earlier, because I've also done a lot of work on the teens and 20s, and there's something going on there. But William Burroughs' book, Queer, there's a kind of subculture that's starting to name itself in that period that connects very much to the kinds of art making that are putting the body in motion and interrogating those fixtures of modernism. But then there's also the queer that I grew, that I came of age reading, that is a much more, 1980s, 1990s formulation, which starts to do something quite different and to pull it completely away from those subcultures, which often there is a devolution back into a kind of essentializing concept of sexual object choice and what they were actually doing in their spare time and so on. So I think there has to be a tension between those, really. And the person whose queer theory I am probably the most indebted to, both in theorizing the performative and in theorizing queer, is Eve Sedgwick. And she said something quite beautiful. I think it's in Tendencies, where, she says the queer is this kind of fluid, anything that works against elements of normativity, but at the same time, we always have to remember there are certain kinds of bodies that are oppressed and we can never pull it fully away from. So again, that kind of sexual identification. I think both have to be there. The same way in feminism, we've long grappled with the way we kind of do and don't want to be talking about essentialized female bodies. Inevitably we do when we're talking about speculums and saying we don't want men to design them. That's a great example of where there is an essentializing impulse, but we also don't, because, some of us don't, I certainly don't, because I don't think we know what a woman is, actually. We certainly don't now with the very powerful emergence of trans culture and gender fluidity. So they have to be in tension, I think.
Okay, it's 1:05, but we can go 10 more minutes, but then we have to finish.
Other questions?
Hi, thank you for your talks. My question is for kind of Derek and Amelia, and I'll begin by Amelia's talk about how performativity and kind of deprivilegizing vision integrates temporality back into discussion in art, and how maybe performativity not just reintegrates temporality, but may reconceive of temporality and how time works. And so thinking about the way queerness, or maybe the black male body, may be anticipatory rather than backwards looking, or even integrated in its own moment. And I'm thinking specifically in Derek's work on the board game, how the body is anticipated even if you don't see it, in terms of its own integration in the game itself. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk about how queer bodies or black bodies, even in their absence, may anticipate an embodiment or a reconception of temporality and time, if that makes sense.
Regarding that particular game, Crossroad, the idea behind trying to create a performative structure and be a part of it as a participant in the beginning stages of the sculpture, the performance sculpture, was really about making myself more invisible. But as a black person in the arts, when you use your body in your work, the politics is already embedded in the physical. So the goal for that particular sculpture was to allow other people to operate the game when I wasn't there. But the dynamic that happened when I was present in the space created a certain reality of being of anticipation, and also from the audience, but also a like an idea of one thing that happens a lot with me when I'm making performance work is this idea of cool, or am I cool enough as an audience when they walk into a space where I'm doing something? There's like a resistance. It is not necessarily because a lack of desire to participate, but the idea that I'm representing something as a physical person in the space that is attached to something much more related to images of popular culture and images of representation of the black male body, which is much, as a creative, is very much equal to a queer body. Because as a black artist who's male, in a creative space, you represent this idea of openness. And also, depending on how you present yourself, you are much more compatible to the female, depending on how you're presenting yourself as an intellectual or as an artist type. So there's a lot of assumptions about different roles that represent me as an artist, which I think are interesting. But I think that when you make a performance that really engages the audience, you really start to see how social structures exist and how they can actually be learning tools for a performance to know how to connect with people. And that was one of the reasons why I created the space, that sculpture for that space, is because I've never been to Omaha, and I know my time there was short, and the possibility of going out into the community in the way I wanted to go out into the community, where people were saying, like, you shouldn't go to this part of town, or you shouldn't go to that part of town, was also something that was happening in conversations outside of the gallery space. So that piece was really designed in a way of kind of connecting with the community as a piece, as a work. So it was a big challenge. It was. I don't know if it's successful. Now that I'm gone, other people are operating the game, and I think it's going to change the space.
Well, I'm going to use your example because I think that the piece that you do with the Dave Hammonds is about kind of taking up the way we always get anticipated to be a certain way. So in the art world, what does it mean to be a black man, doing performance? And then for you to create this kind of recursive loop back to this super important performative artist from an earlier generation is a way both of, looking back to empower yourself through that kind of relationship, but also opening up maybe a new possibility of a different kind of anticipation or futurity for people engaging you. So as someone who teaches a lot of the Black arts movement, just seeing that is really very moving, and I'm going to include it now so that my students know, because a lot of art students don't really intuitively grasp the importance of knowing the history of earlier artworks. And I think that's a part of what performance can do, is it can actually recuperate and enact a relationship to that.
Can I just add one quick thing here, because it occurs to me that this totally relates back to yesterday's the 4 categories, object categories that were presented
Witness,
of
Three. I
witness,
think there were 3,
specimen,
yeah.
work, and cultural artifact. And that one of the conversations in the audience was how, but we're talking about the objects, we're not talking about how that activates an experience.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that what the body is doing, or what your work is doing in that particular piece, is you are doing that. You are creating that as that sort of zone of encounter. So it has all of that other register of stuff that is very sort of live and emotive.
That's what I was thinking when I saw the presentation. I was thinking, I think I do that. Like, I think that just as an artist, I'm always really aware of the actual engagement of myself as an artwork in a space with other objects that are also artworks, and how people encounter that and how they respond to those things. And I think it's empowering. I don't think of it in a negative way. I think it's really interesting just to see how people respond to me as an artist, and how they respond when I'm not in the space, when I have installations that are in place at a space. It's very different, and it's something that I feel is empowering for me as a creative, because I'm learning how to engage. It's almost like it's an experiment in some sort with the audience, and learning what they're willing to accept, or how they want to learn. Because people can show you how they want to learn, how they want to absorb information based on the way they encounter you, they encounter your work.
And there's something about the way you're willing to be vulnerable, which I was also trying to get at in those examples I showed, that's for me what opens up what I'm starting to theorize as a kind of queer space, in the sense of that allows for desire, the expression of desire, or repulsion, or fear, or anxiety. And that's a super hard thing to do, but it's really, really productive, I think.
Okay, before we close, I want to make an announcement. The next session will be on aesthetics and law here at, I think it's 2:30. And after that session at 4:30, there will be a public sort of a salon discussion, including all the participants, to sort of reflect upon 2 days worth of materials. I mean, really a rich material. So public is invited. And for those of you from RISD, it's a college building, old library space. And if you are not from RISD, because it's RISD ID card access only. So I suggest if you want to participate, then I suggest you come back to this auditorium no later than 4:15, and then those of us with RISD ID will direct you. Okay?
And now it's lunchtime. Thank you. Thank you, Dave.